The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life
by Drunvalo Melchizedek.
Narrated by Danit Friedman. Chapter 7. The Measuring Stick of the Universe. The Human Body and its Geometries. Geometry within the human body. It's easy to see how the 5 Platonic solids influence the structural pattern of crystals and metals. Metals also have atomic lattices. It's simple to see the geometrical relationship of these types of molecules. But when you look at yourself or at a baby being formed, it's much more difficult to see how this kind of geometry could have anything to do with us at all. Yet it does. In the beginning of your life, in the womb, you were nothing but geometrical forms. See figure 7.1. In fact, all life forms, trees, plants, dogs, cats, everything, have the same geometrical and structural pattern running through them that ran through you when you were microscopic. Their very life and structural support depend on the forms. In fact, all life forms are these geometrical patterns, but it is not apparent to the casual eye. The geometrical relationships are important to perceive, not only so the brain can realize the unity of all life, but for another reason, so that we can understand these electromagnetic structural patterns around our body and beg to recreate the living Merkaba around us. In the beginning is the sphere, the ovum. Figure 7.2 is a sea urchin egg with sperm swarming around it. I'm going to be talking primarily about human beings and human conceptions, but I'm actually discussing all life forms known on Earth, because the procedure illustrated in the next few figures is identical for every life form known. Not just humans, but everything. Every known life form begins as a sphere. It's the most female form there is, so it makes perfect sense that the female will choose that shape to form the ovum. Figure 7.3. The ovum is a perfect round ball. Another example of a round ovum is inside the chicken egg. When you remove the yolk from a hard-boiled egg, you can see how perfectly round it is. All of us begin as a sphere. I would like you to notice some simple things about this ovum first. There is a membrane around it called the zona pellucida. Remember this because I will refer it over and over again. It has to do with why the ancients put 2 circles around the flower of life, instead just 1 or none. Inside the membrane is a liquid, and inside that, just like the chicken egg, there's another perfectly round sphere called the female prounucleus, which contains 22 plus 1 chromosomes, half the chromosomes necessary to create a human body. The number of chromosomes changes depending on the life form, and those particular chromosomes are different in every life form. Inside the zona pellucida, there are 2 polar bodies. I'll explain those in a moment. The number 12. When you were first learning about human biology, you were probably told that it takes 1 sperm for conception to occur. That isn't true. According to Time magazine, even though most textbooks still state this, it is now known that the ovum must be absolutely saturated with hundreds of sperm, or conception is not even possible. Second, out of those hundreds, 10, 11, or 12 must come together in some kind of pattern on the surface, a pattern they're still trying to figure out. That allows the 11th, 12th, or 13th sperm to enter the ovum. Figure 7.4. 1 sperm cannot get through the membrane without the other 10, 11, or 12. It is not possible except under unnatural conditions, where a human manipulates the conception. This image brings up what was possibly hidden in the life of Jesus. Jesus came here to a round ball called Earth, which was saturated with people. The first thing he did was gather 12 males together, no females. Jesus, from my point of view, and from his I'm sure, because he could not have done what he did without the 12 disciples. Seldom. Does not anyone wonder why he gathered those 12 disciples together? He absolutely had to have them. He could have done it with 10 or 11, but he chose 12. I believe that the number of sperm that join to allow the one sperm to enter the egg determines the sex, and Jesus chose 12. Prior to Jesus' time, in Greece, near the era of his ministry, people saw the earth as a sphere. Right after that, they began to see the earth as a cube and flat. Then, 400 years ago, Copernicus came along and changed it back to a sphere. So people's perception of the earth went from the sphere to a cube and back to the sphere. Exactly the same thing, sphere to cube to sphere, goes on during conception, only at a much faster rate. I don't know if this analogy is true or not, but it sure does look like it.
The sperm becomes a sphere. Anyway, the little sperm gets in through the zona pellucida with the help of the other sperm and then starts swimming toward the female pronucleus, figure 7.5. The first thing that happens is that the sperm's tail breaks off and disappears, is just gone. Next, the tiny sperm's head expands and becomes a perfect sphere, which is the male pronucleus. It becomes exactly the same size as the female pronucleus, and it contains the other half of the necessary information. The words exactly the same size, I believe, are very important when you look at the next figure. Next, they pass through each other and form a geometrical relationship called the vesica Pisces, figure 7.6. It's not possible for two spheres to pass through each other and perfectly coincide without forming a vesica Pisces. This means that at that exact moment, the male and the female pronucleus form the image of the first motion of the first day of Genesis. And literally all the information of the reality and light is contained in that geometry. It's so simple. That image could not be formed unless these two pronucleus were the same size. It's for that reason, I believe, that the female determines which sperm will enter. Science proved around 1992 that the determination factor for which sperm will enter is the female. She selects the one to allow in. Just as everybody in this room has a different projection length into a dark space or into the void, each little sperm also has a different size sphere around it. She's not going to let him in unless his size is identical to hers. If it's a matching key, okay. If it's not, forget it. This could explain why many people who have tried to have babies cannot have them. There's no explanation that anybody can see. This might be at least one explanation.
The first human cell. After the two pronuclei make a vesica Pisces, the male pronucleus continues to permeate the female pronucleus until they are one, figure 7.7. At this time it's called a human zygote, the first cell of the human body. So you began as a sphere before you created your familiar human body. Actually, you were a sphere within a sphere. The next thing you need to know is that the human zygote will not change size during the first 9 cell divisions. It's fixed, as is the size of the outer membrane. The human zygote is about 200 times bigger than the average cell in the human body. So big, you can actually see it with your naked eye. When it divides into 2, each of those 2 cells are half of the original size. And when those 2 cells divide into 4, each cell is a quarter of the original size. The cells keep dividing like this, getting littler and littler, until they've divided 8 times and number 512. At that point, the average cell size of the human body is reached. When that happens, mitosis continues and the dividing cells expand beyond the boundaries of the original zona pellucida. So, first, the growth goes into itself, then out beyond itself. When the first growth goes inward, it's as if it's trying to figure out how to do it. Once it figures that out, it goes beyond itself. All life uses this process. I use that same understanding to figure out some of the geometries, which you'll see later. Figure 7.8 is an electron microscope photograph of the first cell
of a mouse egg, forming a central tube. The next thing that happens in the conception process is that those little polar bodies begin to migrate through the zona pellucida. One goes down and becomes the South Pole, and the other becomes the North Pole. Then, out of nowhere, a tube appears, running right down through the center of the cell. Then, the chromosomes break in half, and half of them line up along one side of the tube and half along the other. Figure 7-9. This is a familiar image in human energy fields. It's very much like the energetics of an adult human being. As you study this further, you'll see that you have a similar sphere of energy around you. You have a North Pole and a South Pole, and you have a tube running down through your body. Half of you is on one side of that tube, and half is on the other. So this picture is very much like the energy field of an adult human being, though the human energy field is much more defined than that. But we've got to wait until we get further along to see how true this is. After the chromosomes have lined up along the two sides of the tube, they form into two cells, one on each side of the tube. And each cell contains 44 plus 2 chromosomes, figure 7-10. Here are the first two cells in a mouse egg, figure 7-11. The zona pellucida has been taken away so you can see the inner part. An important piece of information came up around 1992. Many books said that the female gave 22 plus 1 chromosomes and the male gave 22 plus 1. That was flat out true, according to them. It wasn't even considered that it could be anything else. But that has now been found to be untrue. The female can give any number whatsoever. She can give 22 plus 1, or all 44 plus 2, or any number in between. This new information has completely changed the field of genetics. They've thrown almost everything they knew out of the window and started over. Scientists used to depend on electron microscopes for photographs. Now they have laser microscopes that can take movies, so they can watch these things happening. They're gaining information very rapidly. I'm sure they are a lot further now than we are showing you. Science is in the midst of mapping every one of the 100,000 chromosomes in the DNA of the human body. Within just a few more years, we'll know what every single chromosome is and what it does, which means that you will be able to engineer any kind of human being you can imagine, create any appearances or intelligence or emotional body, anything we want. We'll be able to do it and know exactly what we will get. Are we God? This is a question that must be answered. The first 4 cells form a tetrahedron. The next step is that the cells divide again, going from 2 to 4, a binary sequence, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. Most textbooks show the first 4 cells forming a little square, but that's not what happens. They actually form a tetrahedron, one of the Platonic solids. And the apex of the first tetrahedron points either to the North Pole or to the South Pole, figure 7-12. The tetrahedron is formed by linking the centers of the spheres together. I believe that whatever it points, north or south, probably determines which sex it is. They haven't discovered that yet, but they'll probably figure it out, based on the polarities of the tetrahedron. If the tetrahedron forms with an apex pointing to the South Pole, toward the feet of the newly forming fetus, it should be female. If it forms with an apex pointing to the North Pole, toward the head, it should be male. If this is true, they'll be able to determine immediately what the sex is. Since they'd have to do that within about an hour or so after conception, it will be fairly inconvenient. These are the geometries of the first tetrahedron, figure 7-13. The side view is on the right and the top view is on the left. Figure 7-14 is an electron microscope view of a mouse egg. In this picture, it's growing really fast, but it's still aligned through the north-south pole. That tiny cell is beginning to form beyond the original tetrahedron. The fourth point of the tetrahedron is in the center of the large cell in the background. Next, the cells divide into 8. They form one tetrahedron facing up and one tetrahedron facing down, and you get the star tetrahedron. Here it is, the egg of life, figure 7:15. This form came out of Genesis, remember? It came out of Spirit's second rotation. Every single life known on Earth, anyway, and probably everywhere, must pass through the egg of life. According to the angels, this point, where the original 8 cells form a star tetrahedron, or a cube, depending on how you look at it, is one of the most important points in the creation of the body. Science has also recognized that this particular stage of development is different from any other, and it has many unique qualities that don't occur at any other time in its development. The most important quality of these original 8 cells is that they appear to be identical. There appears to be nothing different about them at all. Usually, it's easy to see the difference between one cell and another, but here they all appear to be the same. Researchers have tried to find the differences, but they couldn't. It will be as though there were 8 identical twins in this room, dressed exactly alike, with their hair combed exactly the same way. Scientists have found that they can split the egg into 2 at this point, through the middle of the cube, with 4 cells in one part and 4 in the other, and 2 identical people, or rabbits, or dog, or anything else will be created. They've also been able to sever it once more, making 4 identical life forms. I don't know if anybody has been able to go further than that and make 8 life forms, but they've definitely gone as far as 4.
Our true nature is in our original 8 cells. According to the angels, these original 8 cells are closer to who you really are than your physical body is. Closer to your true nature. That sounds odd, I know, because we're used to identifying with our human bodies. But these 8 cells are closer to who we really are. The angels say these 8 cells are immortal relative to your body. You get a brand new body every 5 to 7 years. Every single cell in your body dies within a 5 to 7 year period and is replaced with a new one, except for the original 8 cells. They remain alive from the time you're conceived until the time you die and leave the body. All the rest go through their life cycles, but not these 8. These cells are centered in the precise geometric center of your body, which is slightly above the perineum. There is a little piece of skin there, and even though there is not a physical opening, there is actually an energetic opening. That's where the central tube runs through your body, coming out the top through the crown chakra at the top of your head. If you look at a newborn baby during the first few weeks, you'll see the top of its head pulsing. If you were to look at the bottom of the baby, at its perineum, you'd see the same pulsing. That's because the baby is breathing in the proper way. Both ends are pulsing because the energy is flowing from the 2 poles, coming not only from the top down, but from the bottom up and meeting. This is the basic understanding of the Merkaba. From the point where the original 8 cells are located, it's the same distance to the top of your head as it is to the bottom of your feet. And the cells are arranged just as they were when they first came into existence, in the egg of life pattern, north up, south down. If you noticed in the previous illustration, when the egg of life is oriented to the north and south, you can actually see through the middle to the light-colored sphere on the backside. That's very different than when you look at it as a hexagon. You can't see through a hexagonal pattern. I want you to notice this difference for later, when we talk about doing the meditation to activate the Merkaba. Figure 7:16 and the next 2 views are the first 8 cells. These original 8 cells are the key, because according to the angels, we don't grow like a string bean, getting longer and longer. We actually grow radically in 360 degrees from the original 8 cells. This picture of the mouse egg was taken just as the 8 cells started to divide again. Figure 7:17. It's not a great photograph, as these pictures are difficult to get.
The cells are dividing very quickly. They have to strip off the zona pellucida, have the cells stop at the right place, then take the photograph. The star tetrahedron cube of the 16 cells becomes a hollow sphere, torus. After the 8-cell division, it divides into 16 cells, whereupon it forms another cube or star tetrahedron on the end. This is the last time it will be symmetrical. When it divides into 32, 16 cells are in the middle and 16 on the outside. If you take the 16 on the outside and try to fill it in the empty spaces to keep it symmetrical, you will find it is not possible. I've actually done this. You end up with 2 spaces no matter how you do it. It needs 18 cells to be symmetrical. You wonder why? At the next division, there are 32 more cells, but it gets worse. Figure 7.18. You wonder what's going on in here? It's getting weird. Where did all the symmetry go? Well, it was meant to do that. It starts turning into a blob. We become a blob for a while, but the blob has consciousness in its blobness. Then it stretches, and the inside starts turning out, becoming a hollow ball, like this photo, figure 7.19. Once it gets to this stage, it becomes a perfect hollow sphere. Then the North Pole starts dropping through the space inside, going down towards the South Pole. And the South Pole comes up through the space to meet the North Pole. The embryo in this photo has been broken apart so the center could be photographed.
If you could see it in its completeness, it looks just like an apple curved through the middle. The hollow sphere then becomes a torus. A spherical torus like the photo on the right. Every single known life form goes through this torus stage. This formation in the apple torus shape is called the morula. After this, the expansion goes beyond the zona pellucida, and the cells begin to differentiate. The hollow space inside the torus becomes the lungs. The North Pole becomes the mouth. The South Pole becomes the anus, and all the eternal organs from inside the tube that runs through the middle. If it's a frog, it begins to get little legs. Or if it's a horse, a little tail grows. For a fly, little wings develop. And a human starts to look like a human. But before this differentiation, we all look like a torus. I suspect this is why, though I don't have any proof. Biblical tradition says that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is an apple tree. We really do turn into something that looks very much like an apple at one stage. Progression of life forms through the Platonic solids. To summarize, we start out as a sphere, the ovum. We then move to a tetrahedron at 4 cells, then onto 2 interlocked tetrahedrons, which is a star tetrahedron or a cube, at 8 cells. From 2 cubes at 16 cells, we turn back into a sphere beginning at 32 cells, and from the sphere we become a torus at 512 cells. Planet Earth and its magnetic field is also a torus. All of these forms are sacred shapes that comes out of the first informational system of the fruit of life, which is based on Metatron's cube. We could go on for probably another 7 or 8 months talking about this subject, showing you how more and more things are connected to these 5 shapes, the Platonic solids. But I think you can see exactly what I mean. By the way, modern mathematicians say that the Platonic solids have been known only since civilization began about 6,000 years ago. But this is not true. Some put their discovery during the time of Greece. Archaeologists have recently found some perfect models in the earth, perfectly cut in stone, that were found to be 20,000 years old. Those hairy barbarians absolutely knew more than we give them credit for.
Underwater birthing and dolphin midwives. I would like to take a quick digression from the geometries of birth to something slightly different. A Russian named Igor Cherkovsky has been involved in underwater birthing for a long time. He probably assisted with at least 20,000 underwater births. His daughter, one of the first to be born underwater, was in her 20s, I think, when the following incident took place. Cherkovsky and his team has taken a woman to the Black Sea for an underwater birth. They were sitting there, prepared for the birth, with the woman lying in water about 2 feet deep. As I remember, 3 dolphins approached, pushed everyone away, and took over. The dolphins did something that looked like scanning up and down her body, something I have experienced, and which does something to the human system. The woman gave birth with almost no pain, no fear. It was a phenomenal experience. That experience with underwater birthing began a new practice of using dolphins as midwives, which has now spread all over the world. There's something about the sonar that dolphins project at the time of birth that seems to really relax the mother. Dolphins have preferences with humans. This is not an absolute rule, but is usually true. If you go swimming with dolphins and there are children around, the dolphins go to the children first. If there are no children, they go to the women. If there are no women, they go to the men. And if there's a woman who's pregnant, everyone else can forget it. She gets their total attention. That little incoming baby is the greatest thing of all. The dolphins become very excited when they see a human giving birth. They just love it. Dolphins can do things that are really amazing. Babies who were born with midwifing dolphins, at least as it's going in Russia, are extraordinary children. From everything I've read so far, not one of those babies has an IQ under 150, and they all have extremely stable emotional bodies and extremely strong physical bodies. They seem to be superior in one way or another. France has also had underwater birth, over 20,000. They gave birth in a tank. When they first started doing this, they had all the instruments laid out on tables and all the emergency supplies ready, with a doctor standing by in case there was a problem. But they didn't have a problem for a long time. A year went by and they still hadn't had a problem. Still another year went by, and finally 20,000 births went by without one single complication. Now they just have the instruments and the equipment stuck in a corner somewhere, because there simply aren't any problems. I don't know if they know why, but for some reason, when a woman is floating in water, it seems like most complications solve themselves. I got to spend some time with a woman who was an assistant with Tchaikovsky in Russia. She had brought back many films that were taken during the births. I watched 2 movies of 2 different women giving birth who not only were not in pain, but they were enjoying while having their babies. I know that's the way it's supposed to be. It simply makes sense, and these women were proving it. I've also seen some Russian movies where babies and children, 2 or 3 years old and older, sleep on the bottom of the swimming pools. They literally sleep underwater on the bottom of the pool, and about every 10 minutes they come up while they're asleep, roll their face over the surface, take a breath, go back down and settle on the bottom again. These kids live in water. That's their home. They're being given a name, almost like they're a different species. People are calling them Homo dolphinos. They seem to be a blend between humans and dolphins. Water is becoming their natural medium, and they're extremely intelligent. So I have a great deal of respect for underwater birthing, and the possibility of having dolphins there at the same time is truly a gift. I think it's a healthy trend the way many countries are allowing this new way to birth, though in the United States there's a lot of pressure against it. Lately in the United States, the pressure seems to have subsided, and I think you can do it legally now in Florida and California. Around the world, in New Zealand, Australia, and other places, there are lots of centers. And of course, the more women see more women not in pain, obviously, they're going to want to do it too. Geometries that surround the body. Here we go with the next adventure. We've now seen how the geometries unfold in conception. We saw how we started with a little cube of 8 cells, which became the center of our bodies. Now I want to look at the geometries outside the body. The way the angels explained it to me is the way I am going to give it to you. This began when I was in Boulder, Colorado, sometime between 1976 and 1978. I can't pinpoint it for sure. I was living in a communal home with a bunch of friends and had my own bedroom. One night the angels came in with a new teaching for me. They showed me the geometries by projecting glowing forms in space. It will be like a holographic images that will appear maybe 7 or 8 feet away from me, and I'd work with them from there. In my room, the angels showed me this image of a circle and a square, figure 720. They said they wanted me to find this image in the Metatron's cube, figure 721. Then they said goodbye and left, leaving me with no real instructions on how to proceed. After they left, I figured this wouldn't be too hard, because they were always giving me little things to do. I'd do them, wait for them to come back, then they'd give me something else to do. I figured it wouldn't take long. But as I found out, it wasn't that easy. At least 4 months went by, and I still couldn't figure it out. The way I see it, the angels intervened directly to help me with this. I was sitting there in my room one night, around 9. The floor was covered with drawings. I used my floor as a table because I had too many drawings. My door was closed, and I was sitting there studying my drawings, trying to solve the problem the angels had given me. I had so many drawings you wouldn't believe it, trying to figure out where the circle and the square were in Metatron cube. In those days, I didn't tell anybody what I was doing. I didn't tell people for a long time because it was a very personal experience for me. And quite frankly, nobody was interested anyway. Nobody cared about geometry back then because it had not emerged into most people's consciousness as it has now. The Masonic key to squaring the circle. Someone knocked on the door. I opened my bedroom door, and here's this tall guy standing there. I had never seen him before in my life. He looked kind of sheepish, and he said, "I was supposed to come here to tell you some things." I asked his name and more about what he wanted. "Well," he said, "I was sent here by the Masons to tell you about the circle and the square." This really jolted me. I sort of froze in my track and just looked at him for a moment. Tried to understand how this wasn't happening. Then I figured I didn't really care how it was happening, only that it was. I just grabbed him by the hand and said, "Get in here," pulling him in and closing the door. I said, "Anything you have to tell me, I want to know what it is." So he drew this drawing, figure 722. First, he drew the square. Then he drew the circle around the square in a particular way, and there was the image I had seen glowing in my room. I thought, this is going to be good. He divided the square into 4 sections. Then he drew diagonals from the corners through the middle to the opposite corners. Then he drew diagonals through the 4 smaller squares. Then he drew lines from I to E and E to J. Next, he drew lines from I to H and H to J, E and H being the points on the circle's circumference, where the vertical center line intersected. Up to this point, I'd had no problem. But then he drew a line from A to nowhere, G, and back to B, and from D to nowhere, F, and back to C. I said, "Wait a minute, that isn't the rules I was given. That doesn't fit, there's nothing there." And he said, "It's okay because the line AG is parallel with the line IH, and this line, DF, is parallel to this line, JE. "Well," I said, "that's a new rule. I didn't have that one before. I mean, there's nothing there." "Parallel lines? Well, okay, I'll listen." Then he began to tell me all kinds of things. He said that the first key is that the circumference of the circle and the perimeter of the square are equal, which is what I told you before. This circle and square is the same image seen from the air as that of the Great Pyramid with the ship sitting on top. The Pi ratio. He began to tell me about the Pi ratio of 1.618, rounded here to 3 decimal points. The Pi ratio is a very simple relationship. If you had a rod and you were going to put a mark on it somewhere, only 2 places will mark the Pi ratio, shown as points of A and B in his illustration, figure 723. There are only 2 places depending on which end you're coming from. Shown on the lower drawing, it's a relationship such that if you divide D by C and E by D, the 2 answers will be the same, 1.618. So you divide the longer portion by the shorter portion,
and that gives you the ratio 1:6:1:8. When you divide the whole length of E by the next shorter portion, which is D, you'll get the same ratio. It's a magical place. Even though I was studying mathematics in college, when this incident took place, the Pi ratio somehow had gone over my head. I didn't get it. I had to go back and restudy all this stuff. This guy also brought up Leonardo's drawing with the circle and the square around it, giving me more information, which I'll tell you later. I asked him many questions, and about half the time he didn't know the answer. He'd just say that's the way it goes, or I don't know. We don't know that. Though I can't say this for certain, I suspect the Masons have lost a great deal of their information. I think that they once had a brilliant knowledge that was very much like the Egyptians, and both of those disciplines have gone downhill. Before he left, he drew the sketch at the bottom of his diagram. See figure 722. With a square and the right eye of somebody. I can't say Horus because I don't know who it is. And then left. I've never seen him since. I don't even remember his name. Applying the key to Metatron's cube. This gentleman from the Masons didn't answer the question specifically. How the circle and the square fit into Metatron's cube. In fact, I don't think he'd ever seen Metatron's cube. But something he said triggered something in me, so that I understood what it was. Right after he left, I knew the answer. As you know, Metatron's cube is really a three-dimensional object, not a flat object. Three-dimensionally, Metatron's cube looks like this, figure 724. It's a cube within a cube, three-dimensionally. Then, if you rotate it to this view, figure 725, you have its square aspect. Once you do that, you have figure 726. At this point, you can drop the outer aspect. All you need are just the original 8 cells. Around those 8 cells, there's already a sphere, the zona pellucida. The cells are in the shape of a cube, so if you draw both a circle and straight lines around it, you get the image of the circle and the square the angel showed me. I was happy. The two concentric circles, spheres. But then I calculated the perimeter of the square and the circumference of the circle, and they were not equal. I was bummed out for a long time because I figured I hadn't found it. About 3 years later, I discovered that I had found it, but I had just not understood. In sacred geometry, when you find something that appears incorrect or breaks the idea you're trying to form, you have to keep going deeper because often you just don't have the whole picture yet. What I discovered was that the zona pellucida has a thickness to it. There's an inner surface and an outer surface. Every membrane has an outer and inner surface, and when you use the outer surface of the zona pellucida, the proportions go into a near perfect Pi ratio. The amount of imperfection is actually part of the equation. You'll know what that means in a while. This is why there are 2 lines around the flower of life, the inner and the outer circle of the zona pellucida. So from now on, whenever you see 4 circles in a square, we're talking about the egg of life, the original 8 cells. Just take it for granted. So in this drawing, figure 727, I drew in all the lines that the Mason drew just to see how they would line up and what will happen, comparing the Mason drawings to the 8 cells. Nothing appeared to be happening in the middle of the drawing that I could see, though I suspected something at this point, which had to do with the circle that would just fit in the middle of the 4 spheres. But I did discover that the corners of the square, actually a cube, define the exact centers of the outer layer of cells in the 16-cell division, as at point A. This was an interesting observation, so I began to doodle and study further to see what they meant. Obviously, the angels wanted me to go down this road, but I had no idea where this road led. Studying Da Vinci's Canon, I decided to look deeper at this drawing of Leonardo's, figure 728. I had also majored in art, so I had studied much of Leonardo's work, but I didn't realize until later how much artwork he had done. This drawing has become probably one of his most famous works. It's perhaps even more important to us than the Mona Lisa
or any other famous work of his. This kind of drawing, a standard for something, in this case a standard for human beings, is called a canon, a human canon. The first thing that struck me about this drawing is how amazingly we all attune to it. For instance, because there are 30 frames per second that come across on a video, you could flash this drawing of Leonardo's for just an instant, yet people would immediately recognize it. We know something there is important. Perhaps we don't know exactly what it is, but we still retain the image. There is a tremendous amount of information about us in this drawing, but as it turns out, it's not really about us. It's about who we used to be, not about who we are now. To begin this analysis, notice first that there are lines drawn over the arms and the trunk, across the chest and over the legs and neck. The head is divided into another series of lines. Notice that the feet are drawn at both 90 degrees and 45 degrees. Subtle things. Also notice that if you were to stand with your arms straight out and your legs straight down, a square or a cube forms around your body, as in Leonardo's drawing. The center of that square is located exactly where the original 8 cells are, which is also a square or cube in the center of your body. Notice the small cube around your original cells and the bigger cube around your adult body. When you're standing with your arms outstretched like Leonardo's men, there is a difference between the height and the width of your square. Computers have shown by measuring 100 people or more that there is 1/10,000th of an inch difference between the width of your outstretched arms and your height. Though I couldn't understand for a long time why the difference was there, I think I know now. It has to do with the Fibonacci series, which life is based on. You will see this shortly. If you put your legs out to the side, like the outer legs on Leonardo's drawing, stretched out your arms like the upper arms, a perfect circle or sphere fits around your body, and its center is located exactly at the navel. When you do that, the circle and the square exactly touch at the bottom. If you were to move the center of the circle down to the center of the square, the circle and the square will synchronize just like they do in the Mason drawing, and the drawing that shows the worship superimposed over the top of the Great Pyramid. It is a major secret of life. When you measure almost all the copies of Leonardo's drawing, you find that the circle is really an oval and the square is really a rectangle. It's different in all of them because they've been copied and folded so many times. But in the original accurate drawing, the hand length from the wrist line to the longest finger equals the distance from the top of the head to the top of the circle when the two centers are aligned. This same length shows up between the navel and the center of the square. So when you bring the two centers together, everything aligns. Pi ratios in the human body. As I was discovering this, I thought, we have these geometrical forms that appear to be outside the body as well as inside it. One of the things the angel said, which really stuck with me, was that the human body is the measuring stick of the universe, that absolutely everything in the universe can be measured and determined from our bodies and from the energy field around them. Since the Pi ratio seems to be such an important aspect to the Mason, and since he went on and on about it, I wanted to see where it was in the human body. I discovered it, and of course, other people have also discovered it. Realize that in figure 729, the square shown is the square around the body, as in Leonardo's drawing, and that the line dividing the square in half is the center line of the human body. Also notice that the line B is not only the diagonal of 1/2 of the square, but is also the radius of the circle. Now, if you are interested in the math, see figure 730, which proves that the Pi ratio is found in the geometrical energy fields around the body in at least this one relationship. There are many other pi relationships in and around the body. The Pi ratio equals 1 plus square root of 5 over 2. If you put this into your computer, you will see the transcendental number of pi continues until your computer runs out of memory. I know most of you out there don't care, but I've presented this information for the few. By the way, I'll just throw this out to you. When you're studying sacred geometry, you'll find that diagonals are one of the major keys for extracting information from your forms. In addition to shadows, expanding from 2 to 3 dimensions, comparing male to female, and so on. It never fails. I believe it was Buddha who asked his disciples to contemplate their navels. Whoever it was, I began to realize as I studied that there was more to the navel than meets the eye. Then I found a medical book, whose authors must have also listened to Buddha, because they did a tremendous amount of research on navels. What the geometries show is that in the ideal, the navel sits at the pi ratio between the top of the head and the bottom of the feet. This is what most books indicate. The authors found out that when a baby is born, its navel is in the exact geometrical center of the body. Both male and female babies start out this way. And as they grow, the navel starts to move toward the head. It moves up to the pi ratio, then continues upward, then it comes back down to below the pi ratio, oscillating during the formative years. I don't know what the ages are, but these movements and locations happen at the specific ages. It never actually stops at the perfect pi ratio in either male or female. But if I remember correctly, male navel ends up slightly above the pi ratio and the female navel just below it. If you average the male and female points, you get the perfect pi ratio. So even though Leonardo's drawing is of a male, it assumes that it is at the pi ratio. But of course, in nature, it would not be. Da Vinci figured out that if you drew a square around the body, then a diagonal from foot to extended fingertip, then drew a parallel line, another one of those parallel lines, from the navel horizontally over to the side of the square, that horizontal line intercepts the diagonal line exactly at its pi ratio, figure 731, as well as that of the vertical line from head to feet. Assuming it's at that perfect point, not slightly above for female or slightly below for males, this means that the human body is divided into pi ratios from top to bottom, which we started earlier. If these lines were the only places in the human body where the pi ratio is located, it will probably be just an interesting fact. But the truth is, the pi ratio is located in thousands of places throughout the body, and it is not just a coincidence. Here are some obvious pi ratio locations in the human body, figure 732. The length of each bone in the finger has a pi ratio to the next bone, as shown in the lower drawing. That same ratio occurs with all your fingers and toes. This is a somewhat unusual relationship because one finger is longer than the other in what appears to be an arbitrary fashion. But it's not arbitrary. Nothing in the human body is. The distances on the fingers marked A to B to C to D to E are all in a pi ratio, as well as the length of the phalanges, F to G to H. If you compare the length of the hand to the length of the lower arm bone, it has a pi ratio, just like the length of the lower arm bone compared to the upper arm bone. Or take the length of the foot to the lower leg bone, or that bone to the thigh bone, and so on. This pi ratio is found throughout the entire bone structure in all kinds of places and ways. It's usually at places where something bends or changes direction. The body also does it through proportionate sizes of one part to another. If you study this, you will be continually amazed. Figure 733 is another way of showing the pi ratio. You make a curve so that you can see how one curve is linked with another, and you can see all the cascading pi ratios of the human body. This is from The Power of Limits by Giorgi Dozzi. I highly recommend this book. Notice that on this male he drew the line for the navel slightly above where the actual pi ratio is located. He knew about that. Very few people I have read understand it. I want to talk about this Greek statue. The Greeks were well aware of this understanding of Phi ratios. So were the Egyptians and many other people in ancient times. When they created a piece of art like this, they were actually using both sides of the brain simultaneously. They were using their left brain to very carefully measure everything. I mean really carefully, not kind of or sort of. They were measuring to make sure that everything was exactly mathematically correct according to the pi proportion. To be as creative as they wanted, they were also using their right brain. They could put any expression on the face and have the statue hold anything or do anything they wanted. The Greeks combined the left and right brain. When the Romans came in and took over Greece, the Romans knew absolutely nothing about sacred geometry. They saw the Greeks' incredible art and tried to duplicate it. But if you compare Greek art to Roman art after they conquered Greece, Roman art looks like it was done by amateurs. Even though Roman artists were really good at what they didn't know they were supposed to measure everything, that there had to be this kind of perfection for the body to look real.
The Phi ratio in all known organic structures. Phi ratio mathematics goes not only through human life, but through the entire spectrum of all known organic structure. You can find this in butterflies, figure 734, or in dragonflies, figure 735, where each little rail section is proportionate to the Phi ratio. The lengths of the sections of the dragonfly from Phi ratios. This illustrator was focusing on one thing, but you can also look where every little bend is in the legs, the length and the width of the wings, the size of the head compared to its width and length, everything. You can go on and on and on, and you'll keep finding the Phi ratio everywhere you look. Look at this frog skeleton, figure 736, and see how every single bone is in Phi ratio patterns, just like in the human body. Fish, I think, are really incredible, because fish don't look like they have any Phi ratio stuff going on, and there are so many different kinds, but when you analyze them, the Phi ratio is there as well, figure 737. The other universal measurement you'll find, one I talked about before, is 7.23 centimeters, the wavelength of the universe. You'll find this wavelength scattered through the body, such as the distance between your eyes, but the Phi ratio occurs more often than any other. Once a measurement of any species has been determined, then every other measurement in that species follows in the Phi ratio proportion. To put it in another way, there are only certain possibilities in human structure, and once the size of one part of the body is determined, that determines the size of the next, and on and on. Soon I'll show you the Egyptian building that Lucy Lamy reconstructed just by measuring one little piece of rubble. This is how she did it. Once she knew the size of the first piece, she knew that every shape after that would relate to it in Phi ratios. The Phi proportions are built into this Japanese pagoda architecture, figure 738. This illustrates another point about creativity that I want to make. When they designed and built this structure, they carefully measured every single distance to match the various lines shown, and they carefully measured where to put each board, right down to that little ball on the top, so that it could correspond and form these relationships we have been studying. I'm sure if someone ever checks, they'll find that the size of the doors, the windows, and probably every small detail are all based on Phi proportions or other sacred geometry. Other classical architectures around the world use the same principles. The Greek Parthenon looks really different from this Japanese structure, but the Parthenon embodies the same mathematics, and the Great Pyramid looks very different from either of those two buildings, but it also embodies the same mathematics, only a lot more. What I'm saying is, your left brain can understand and use these mathematics, and it doesn't hinder creativity at all. It can even enhance it.
Golden mean rectangles and spirals around the body. Another sacred form we have in life is the spiral. You may wonder where it came from. We're living in a spiral. the galaxy, which has spiraling arms. You're using spirals to listen to the sounds around you, because the little apparatus in your ears is in a spiral form. There are spirals all over nature. The more you look, the more you find. Spirals are found in pine cones, snowflakes, a few animals' horns, deer antlers, seashells, daisies, and lots of plants. If you put your open hand vertically in front of you, thumb toward your face, notice the movement as you roll your fingers into a fist, starting with your little finger. They trace out a Fibonacci spiral. This is a very special spiral, as you will see. Where do spirals come from? They have to come from somewhere, and they have to be generated out of the dynamics of the original system, the flower of life, if what we believe is true. Well, all you have to do is go back to the human body, to the same pattern we came up with for the Phi Ratio, see figure 730. If you simply take the diagonal line, lay it down flat, then complete the rectangle formed with that new extension, you have a golden mean rectangle, the source of the golden mean spiral. The outer rectangle of this drawing, figure 739, is called a golden mean rectangle, the same as above. To get another golden mean rectangle, all you have to do is measure the rectangle's shorter edge, side A, and plot that distance along the longer side, side B, which makes a square with equal sides, A equals C. The area that's left over, D, is another golden mean rectangle. Then you can take the shorter edge again and plot that distance along the longer edge to make another square, and what's left over is still another golden mean rectangle. This can continue forever. Notice that each newly formed rectangle is turned 90 degrees. If you ran diagonals across each rectangle, their crossing locates the exact center of the spiral they form. You can see how the diagonals become a key for more information. Line F has a golden mean ratio to line E, continuing inward. We can say that F is to E what G is to F, and H is to G, and I is to H, and so on. There are other kinds of spirals, but the golden mean spiral is paramount in creation. Male and female spirals. There are two kinds of energies that move through golden mean rectangles. One energy is the diagonals that cross the squares, moving at 90-degree turns, shown in black. That's the male energy. The female energy is the line that keeps curving in toward the center, shown in gray. So you have a female golden mean logarithmic spiral, along with a male spiral that uses straight lines with a 90-degree turns at the Phi ratio. In much of the work I will show you, we'll be looking only at the male aspect, but you must remember that the female aspect is always there. Some books say that if you drew a horizontal line through the navel in Da Vinci's Men, figure 740, what's left over in the lower portion is a golden mean rectangle, and that if you drew a line from the top corner to the large square to the middle point at his feet, the center of the opposite side of the square. That semi-diagonal will pass through the exact center of a golden mean spiral as shown in the figure. You can create a spiral if you drew in the consecutively smaller golden mean rectangles like we did in figure 739. I've read several books about this, and I believe it's almost true. But something else is actually happening that is important to understand if one really wants to know about Mother Nature. In fact, I'm convinced that there are no golden mean rectangles or spirals in existence unless they're synthetically made. Nature does not use golden mean rectangles or spirals. It doesn't know how. The reason nature doesn't know how is because a golden mean spiral will literally go inward forever. Maybe not with a pencil and paper, but technically it will go on forever and ever. It will also go outward forever too, because you can take the longest line of any golden mean rectangle, make a square to get a larger golden mean rectangle, and continue to do this forever. So a golden mean rectangle has no beginning and no end. It will go inward and outward forever. This is a problem for Mother Nature. Life doesn't know how to deal with something that has no beginning and no end. We can sort of deal with something that has no end, but if you think about it, it's difficult to think of something having no beginning. Just try to get that in your mind. Something that has no beginning. This is hard for us because we are geometric beings, and geometry has centers, beginnings. Since life doesn't know how to deal with this, it has to find a way to cheat. It has to find another spiral to create with. Life figured out a system of mathematics that approximates this so well that you can hardly tell the difference. The books say that this spiral on Leonardo's drawing in figure 740 is a golden mean spiral, which I say can't be true. Also, there is not just one little spiral here. There are 8 spirals rotating around the body, one for each golden mean rectangle, connected to the 8 possible semi-diagonals around the human body, figure 741. This drawing shows the 8 that intersect the human body. Figure 742 shows the 8 spirals with the 8 centers located around the centers of the body, in the same pattern and with the same center as the original 8 cells inside the body, right? Leonardo drew these little lines that make a grid over and around the body, figure 743. There are 4 squares in the center, A, B, C, and D, clockwise, and 8 squares surrounding them, E through L. Those outer 8 squares happen to be where the 8 semi-diagonals of figure 741 intersect the body and where the 8 spirals of figure 742 begin. So we have 8 places around the body and a central pattern of 4 squares in the middle, centered exactly around the original 8 cells. Life is amazing, is it not? When I noticed this about Leonardo's drawing, I figured there must be something important about this relationship. But when I realized that there is no such thing as a golden mean rectangle or spiral in nature, I began to suspect that these spirals were probably something slightly different, and that's what they turned out to be, slightly different. It turns out that these spirals are Fibonacci in nature, which we will explore in the next chapter. Understanding the difference between the golden mean and Fibonacci spirals may seem simple and unimportant, until the bigger picture of nature unfolds to reveal something astonishing about this relationship. No one can ever understand why the 83,000 sacred sites on the earth were built or what their purpose was without knowing this difference.